Hey, we're back. This is part 2 of Cranky Old Guys Ranting. Michael Zimicki and I are back for part 2. Hopefully you listened to last week's show and you know what we're up to. And this week we're going to continue on talking about some of the myths that are out there and using that as a way to, I don't know, we're going to use those myths to kind of talk about some things that are going to help you be a better driver, hopefully. How does that work for you, Mike?
Sounds good.
Yeah. We left last week with, talking, I mean, first of all, we went through a bunch of rants about, coasting or most important corner, when you get back to throttle, apex angle, all those kinds of things. So we did a bunch of that stuff. But you talked at the very end about why we're doing this. It's not just because we're cranky old guys. We are, but it's not the only reason. We're doing it because we care. We want to help drivers. That we both love what we do. So, you were talking towards the end of last week about the cornering grip of a tire and then coming out of the corner and exit speed and stuff like that. And one of the ones that I want to talk about is and get your thoughts on is drivers that come out of a corner and they have been told, unwind the wheel, straighten the wheel, release the car. And I've said those words to my drivers thousands of times.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But there's a reason for it. And in fact, I don't think it should be led by the steering wheel. It should be led by the throttle. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And that ties into one of the simplest things that people don't get, or a lot of people don't get, even some good drivers. Which is, and the way I phrase it always is really, I think, pretty simple, which is the faster you go, the less your hands have to do with where the car is going and the more your feet do.
Yeah, you're steering the car with your feet.
Yeah, and that ties right back into get off the pedals, right? Which is, if you're turning into a corner, and especially, we talked about last week about how easy it is with ABS cars to have be too buried in the brake pedal. Even with ABS, if you've got the ABS really actively engaged and the steering wheel turned, the car still isn't going to turn as well as it can because it's still trying to slow down.
Yeah.
Right? That's just simple physics.
Yep.
So, you have to get off that pedal, and getting off the pedal, by the way, turning the steering wheel isn't going to help. Getting off the pedal is what's going to help. That's your foot, right? Staying off the pedals if the car needs to turn is a great thing because then the amount of steering input you have in is going to work, or has a better chance at working, right? Which then leads me to, here's a classic. I'm going to make this a mini rant, right? Which is if your steering wheel's turned and the car is not turning, don't turn the steering wheel more. Right?
What?
Like how many times do you watch an in-car video or look at data and you see, the steering wheel turned and you can tell that the car's got push and the guy just cranks more wheel in? It's like, you know what? That wasn't working. So we're not going to, it just isn't going to do you more to try more. Right?
So are you saying that more of the wrong thing doesn't help?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's such a natural instinct, isn't it? Right?
For sure. I mean, at some point in there, it becomes self-preservation, right? You're plowing, pushing off the outside edge of the road. And one of the hardest things to do at that moment in time is to actually straighten the wheel a little bit or get your foot off the brake pedal.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this is one that I think is really interesting because you see top drivers, the best drivers in the world do this thing. I mean, what was it, a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, when Sebastian Vettel was leading the German Grand Prix in the rain, he locks up going into a left-hander and he's sliding off the road. And I'm watching TV going, get off the brake pedal, get off the brake pedal. And he keeps his foot on the brake pedal, locked up, and boom, into the wall. And if he just released the brake pedal. So even a guy like Vettel can get into that self-preservation mode. So I'm not saying it's easy, but
no,
sometimes
there's actually a really good, talking about a little side example of maybe this, we don't want to sound like we're just rants here, but little nuggets of information I can drop, or both of us can drop in here, which is there's a perfect example. I tell guys that if you're in the wet, right, and you're braking and you start to slide off the corner, or the car isn't turning, before you go off the racetrack, even though every preservation instinct in the world is saying, "Oh my God, I got to slow down. I'm going off the racetrack." Take your foot off the brake and see if the car turns.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's that one out of every, what percentage of times where that works, because you being on the brake pedal is what's overcome the tires. And if you take all that braking, force off those tires and just free that tire up the corner, there's a chance it might turn and keep you on the racetrack,
So how many times?
By the way, if the car doesn't turn, go back to the brake pedal before you hit the wall.
There you go. Because you might as well put maximum effort in at that point.
Yeah.
Or brace yourself with the brake.
Right, exactly.
How many times have you had a driver who came back in and they went, and they've got that look on their face like they just had the magic aha moment, and they go, I was going off the track, I was about to slide off the track, I took my foot off the brakes, and the car turned.
Exactly.
So I went back in the next lap and carried that same speed in and just took my foot off the brake, and the car turned. So
exactly.
And that's why I'm going half a second or a second a lap faster.
Right. Yep. But that leads down to, it's really interesting because, as you know, I've made a transition, kind of away from working just with pro racers and back sort of into the gentleman world, which I really like. And I got to tell you that, I mentioned last week that I'd done a teen camp at the Monticello Motor Club.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was really cool and really reinforced some of the stuff I need to do with people going forward, like I would even do it with my pro guys going forward if I end up working with some pro guys again, is getting them in a car on, for lack of a better word, a skid pad. In reality, just a big piece of pavement, not necessarily an oval skid pad, and have them either do a figure eight or a little oval exercise with corner entry stuff. But then also, like I did a kidney shaped little autocross thing. And just that in itself, where you're in that environment, you're away from the racetrack, you're not going hyper fast. We're doing it in BMW M2s. You're not going hyper fast, but you get such immediate feedback to everything from eye usage to what your hands are doing, how your feet are affecting your hands, how your hands aren't doing anything anymore. Like it just drives all that stuff home. That was, and I've done that in the past, taken drivers and gone down to Lime Rock and borrowed cars and been on the skid pad and the autocross courses they have set up there and gone to other places, but I hadn't done it for a while. And I was like, talk about aha moments. It's like one of those things where, as a teacher, you circle back around and rediscover stuff. And I was like, oh my God, I got to do so much more of this,
Well, the drivers that I coach, so many of them that I've had them go off and do some stuff on skid pad stuff. And the challenge with skid pad training is we don't have enough skid pads in our world.
Right.
I wish we had better access to them. And a lot of times, drivers will go, yeah, I want to do that, but where do I go? And it is a little bit difficult. You can find them though. The point is that I think so often we're caught up in this trying to go fast that we forget about going back to the basics of what do I need to learn and what do I need to, last week we talked about, you use the word patterning. I use the word programming. We need to build those habits that just like that happen, so that when the car is sliding off, we don't have to think, what am I supposed to do? Oh yeah. Oh, Mike told me to take my foot off the brake pedal. By that time, it's probably a little bit too late. It needs to become just an instinctual thing where, you get that little lockup, come off the brake, the car turns, poof, I'm okay.
Right. Yeah. And that's a good point, which is you have to have, cars even street cars now are so fast, right? Yeah. If you look at, where street cars were 15 years ago or 20 years ago compared to, like an average like a Honda Accord right now is a freaking fast car, right?
Yeah.
And that's supposed to be like a suburban grocery getter commuter car. So, so it's super easy for people to get into cars that, quite frankly, are going fast. And tire technology has gotten so much better now that it's so easy to be going faster than you want. So there's almost a pet peeve, which is, you get those guys that call you up. I'm sure you get a ton of them. I get them that call you up and they're like, yeah, I've got a special edition McLaren that I want to learn in. Right.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, the first thing I'd like you to do is park the McLaren. It's a great car. It's beautiful. I'm glad you own it. And let's go rent a couple total crappy Miatas, for no money and just spend some time in those. Right. Because they're going to be an unbelievable teaching tool for you. And just, to me, that it's so easy for drivers these days to get into, even in low level, introduction stuff. I mean, for go-karts are fast now.
Yeah.
And finding a way to make it to where you're comfortable. And then the other thing is making sure you're comfortable at a level before you expand up.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I always tell that driver with a McLaren is I'd be happy to store their McLaren for them while they're driving the Miatas. So,
right, exactly.
Hey, you touched on a minute ago, vision and one of the phrases, one of the guidelines, one of the rules that, one of the things that we're talking about here is there are no rules, but
right.
One of the things that gets thrown up there a ton, and I've used it for years, is look where you want to go. And
right.
Like everything here is there are exceptions to the rule.
Oh, absolutely.
Comments on that?
Absolutely. It's, and there's an interesting thing. And I saw who the heck posted something about that a while ago. Somebody that I respect posted something about vision. And by the way, I'll tell you that vision's one of those things. I'll tell you this about me in general, right? Like, I think I'm a pretty darn good coach. And I've been doing it a long time and I work hard at it. And I can tell you flat out that I am not the authority on anything. Right. Which is probably what makes me a good coach.
Yes.
Because I look at myself and I've got enough self-doubt to where I'm like, yeah, and doing it as long as I can. And I'm sure this has happened to you. I look back at drivers I worked with that I won championships with, and I can look back at situations and be like, God, you know what I should have worked on with them? Oh. We could have been faster, right? But the vision thing, I'll tell you, is one of the things that I flat out, when I work with anybody, I flat out tell them right up front, I go, this is such a bizarre, specialized subset of learning to interpretation and how it's perceived by people that nothing I say to you in any way is going to be a definite. Right.
Yeah.
Because everybody's got different ways that they use their eyes. So yes, you're right. Everybody goes, okay, look ahead. Well, have you ever tried that driving along in your streetcar? Doesn't really work, does it? And then it's look where you want to go. That has some truth to it.
Yeah.
But then again, I know that when I'm riding my mountain bike in the woods or when I'm driving around a racetrack, the rare times that I do now, I'm not always looking where I want to go. I'm quite often looking at a reference point, and what I don't do is stare at that reference point until I get to it.
Yeah.
I find the reference point, I find a visual picture around it, I confirm that I'm going to get to the reference point, and before I get to the reference point, I've shifted my eyes to either another picture that looks right or to another reference point. And that is probably as vague and non-technical and horrible as that description sounds. I think it's pretty accurate. And one of the only other way I really talk about it with any consistency is I say it's like a fast slideshow. Yeah. Where you're basically, it isn't a movie because that isn't how things happen. It's like, and that slideshow varies in speed. where one slide sticks up on there. You're looking at one slide for longer. One slide, it's just a flicker flash, that goes by. But yeah, I am, vision is one of those things that's so specialized. Yeah. And once we hear your version of what you think vision is and how vision should be, because I really want to hear that, because I want to learn from you, and get another opinion on it, is I've got a great example to sort of plug in at the end.
Well, first of all, I'm going to say you're more than a pretty darn good coach. You're one of those guys that I worry the most about when I'm competing. And again, I think we talked about being competitive in the past, but we won't go there again.
Yeah.
Because we know that I'm more competitive than you are.
Exactly.
So a couple of things about, first of all, the phrase, look where you want to go. Yeah, general good guideline. But how many times have you seen a driver come up to a corner and they turn the wheel quickly and they apex early? And I think what it is, and I've looked at their, I've either seen in-car video of their head movement, or, I've been on the outside of a corner watching their head, and they come up to a corner and they're so caught up in this, I'm going to turn my head and look to the apex, their hands follow, so they turn in quickly. And so there's a time where look where you want to go isn't quite accurate, because you want to go over there, but you want to carve this arc around over to there.
Right.
So it's almost like you've got to have this mental picture of where you want to go. And I think it kind of goes to your slideshow analogy is, there's the next slide is that apex over there, but you actually have to kind of fill in the arc that gets you to that point.
Absolutely. And that, and there leads to another way that I do describe vision sometimes, which is, I live in a snowy area. And there's, you get a certain snowstorm where there's a little bit of snow sticking to the road that's maybe wet. And you can very easily see, I live in a very rural area, but you'll easily see the tracks of the last car that's driven along, right?
Yeah.
It's these two tracks. And it's almost like you have to be able to visualize those tracks and be following them, right?
Yes.
And that's where the slideshow is taking you. And it's having those visual pictures that allow you to put those tracks together in a seamless, you use the right word, a seamless flow around the racetrack. It might not always feel like a flow, because quite frankly, driving the car at the limit sometimes feels a little ragged. But there's a flow to the car driving around the racetrack, and it is following those tracks. And by the way, if those tracks are 6 inches wide, that sounds about right for precision, right?
Yeah.
Like you are absolutely trying to be. And I really use that analogy in the rain, by the way.
Yeah.
Where I talk about, you're just trying to really, that placement, you're just following those tracks in the snow. So an aside here, which I think is really sort of important, is you and I in a different part of a conversation talked a little bit about, or I brought up Scott Dixon. And if you talk to the IndyCar guys, you catch pretty much everybody in a reflective moment, and they pretty much all think Dixon's the best guy, right? And so, for me, I look at that and I'm like, okay, so if Dixon is the guy that everybody thinks is the guy who's going to be there day in, day out and consistently perform well, then wouldn't you look at as a coach, wouldn't you look at Dixon, or as a driver, wouldn't you look at Dixon and be like, okay, what's he do that works? Right.
Yeah.
And that's obviously in the car, but it's also out of the car, because there's more time out of the car to get ready to be in the car.
Yep.
And I will tell you that, and this will probably sound like a shameless plug, and I'll tell you that I haven't even talked to the guy in probably 5 years. But if you look at Dixon, he spends a lot of time at PitFit.
Jim Leo, yeah.
And Jim Leo has done a great job, a fantastic job of working with guys' vision. If you look at any of the Instagrams he puts up, he's invested heavily in a lot of different light systems that are really cool, that force the guys to make decisions and react, and prioritize their movements with lights. I saw one the other day with a guy who was, not an IndyCar driver, but from a lower formula. And it was a pretty cool thing where Jim had these balls. There were 3 different colored buckets in front of this young fellow. And Jim had these balls he was tossing, and the balls had lights built into them. So as the ball bounced towards the guy, a light came on the ball. And so, a blue light came on in the ball. The guy had to recognize the blue light, catch the ball, put it in the blue bucket.
Yeah.
And then the next ball had come and it was yellow, and then a blue one, and then a red one, and whatever. And they were like coming at the guy fast. So you start looking at stuff like that and you're like, man, there's somebody who's got some hand-to-eye coordination. And by the way, they're doing it where they're having to make decisions as they're doing it. Or you look at some of the things where he's got this one board that's got, these waterfall. It almost looks like a Pong thing with stuff, lights coming in from either side, and you've got to like not allow them to get to the other side and hit them in certain orders, and but all that kind of stuff. And you sit there and Dixon's there all the time. He and Jim Leo are really good friends, and you sit there and you go, ooh, wonder how many of those other guys are spending as much time as Dixon. And I know that other guys work out with Jim. Yeah. But you sit there and you go, man, is everybody doing that? And if I was working with a young guy, and I'm thinking about trying to get one of those boards to work with, or some of the reaction lights to work with some of my drivers, it's like I'd love to use that stuff.
Yeah.
At 61 years old, and I stay active, and I ride a bike a lot, and I run in the woods, and do a lot of things that involve me using my eyes and making decisions and stuff. But you sit there and you go, man, how great would it be to be able to sit there and, after dinner's digested, go down to the cellar and just spend 20 minutes futzing around with something that's going to force me to use my eyes in decision making, because those are all tools that can be sharpened,
And I've done some work with Trey Shannon from Podium Performance in Charlotte, and he does a lot of that same kind of training he works with a lot of NASCAR drivers and a lot of the sports car drivers that are down in that area as well in Charlotte. But, that stuff is, it used to be, did AJ Foyt and Mario Andretti do that stuff? Heck no.
No.
But nowadays, if you want to compete at that level, if you want to be a Dixon, you cannot not do that stuff.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So that brings me to one of the points that you'd brought up when we were initially talking about doing the podcast was natural talent.
Yeah.
Give me your thoughts on natural talent.
Perfect segue. So, no, it really is. And I wasn't, quite frankly, I wasn't even thinking about natural talent when I said that. So here's my take on natural talent. Having worked with, a lot of young drivers in auto racing, but also a lot of young people in ski racing and other sports. I've got one guy I'm working with a bit in ski racing right now who's a well above average talent. And here's my take on natural ability. Everybody genetically, your parents are going to determine some of what you're good at, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of, do you have a propensity to have really good endurance? Do you have a lot of strength? What's your body shape? All that sort of stuff, right? But all that stuff's very adaptable. And my take on natural talent that I developed, I got to tell you, pretty early on, is that, when I was working with, ski racers in the wintertime, or at Skippy schools in the 80s, where I saw thousands of students come through, is the guys and girls that were doing better quicker. If you got talking with them at lunch or in a conversation, they were involved in activities or had been involved in activities that helped them build skills that then crossed over. So, you talk to you have a kid that was, oh my God, this kid's a really good natural, skier, God, they can race, and you'd sit there and you'd say, oh, what do you do after school? Well, I go home and, we live on a farm and I built this cool thing where I'm like jumping off the roof and I grab this thing and swing across the yard and, and whatever. And they're like just doing stuff that challenged them. Right. that force them to do things like develop hand-eye coordination, develop their vision, develop self-confidence, right? And that, that sort of brings me around to, if you, and I'm not certainly the only person to notice this, but in general, a lot of people in the population these days are more careful than they used to be, right? That goes back to the simple things like, oh my God, we never wore helmets when we were kids on a bike or roller skating or whatever. And it was like, yeah, and there were people getting head injuries, so you should wear a helmet now. But it leads back to there were kids doing crazier stuff, right? There's so many kind of after school activities that are, more structured now. And kids aren't, and I'm really diving into some deep waters here, right? And probably get myself in trouble, but kids are not exposed to as many activities that are sort of more edgy, for lack of a better word, which I think really help them develop talents, right? Which is part of why I think when you see these kids today that quote unquote, these kids are really good today. Well, part of it is that, they're better than AJ Foyt was when he was 16 because they've already spent 10 years in go-karts.
Yeah.
Right. They've already developed a ton of time in something that's helping them develop something. But I think on the flip side is that, if you've got if you were going to work with a gentleman driver next week and he turned out to be really good, hadn't driven a car before and turned out to be really good and sort of understood line and stuff, and you started talking to him and he had a ski racing background, you wouldn't be surprised. If he rode his mountain bike 4 nights a week after work on trails, you wouldn't be surprised. So to me, yeah, there's certain genetic markers that are going to help you in some way. But I think that more being natural is more of what you've been exposed to, how you've allowed yourself to learn, what you've pushed yourself to do. And then for lack of a better word, if you've also, and I think this is more of a long-term thing, if you've been in a lifestyle that's helped you develop some grit.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of weird because I could not agree with you more. You sound like me talking right there. And maybe it's, we've both been exposed to so many people coming into the sport through the years, and we've had that opportunity to kind of ask and learn a little bit about their background. I mean, I remember a time early on, I had my school. It was back at Westwood Motorsport Park in Vancouver years ago. And I'd have hundreds of, maybe thousands students come through every year. And you could just get there. You see a driver or somebody get into the car, and within a few laps, they get the line and they're driving smoothly and they're doing stuff. And you go,
right,
what do you do? And, growing up in Vancouver, you get a lot of people go, yeah, I downhill ski. I've done that ever since I was 4 years old or whatever. Right. And I remember this one woman coming through and her second lap was perfect. And I go, right. Wow, you've been skiing all your life? And she goes, I've never been on skis in my life. And I'm like, really? And this kind of went on and on. Right. And I could not believe it. And it was one of those days where I'm going, well, there is natural talent for you. She was just incredible. And then at the end of the day, I through some more questions, I found out she was on the Canadian Olympic equestrian team.
Right.
So she lines, balance, vision, all those things of riding a horse.
Right. Yeah.
So I agree. I mean, so often there have been, a kid or a gentleman driver, whatever. And I said, tell me about what you've done in your life. And you start to find out, they raced BMX bikes. I've had drivers who I would say they weren't super physical in what they did, but they raced RC cars. Well, you just learn about lines, and I got to think, I cannot drive an RC car when it's going. I can drive them when they're going away from me, and when they turn around and come back to me, they're all going.
I can crash them really well.
Yeah, exactly. But to be able to think, they're having to kind of visualize being in the cockpit of that. Like, that is a skill that is learned.
Right.
And I'm not saying that, I think the good thing about our sport is if your DNA means that you're going to be 7 foot tall, driving cars on a track is not the best sport
you're
for
going
you.
to struggle. Right.
Basketball might be a better use, right, of your natural abilities. If you're, but I think our sport, like from a physical perspective, it's not that important. I think what you've done and what's happening throughout your life and all those skills that you learned around balance and vision and all of those things, being able to make good decisions, all that kind of stuff. But the interesting thing, I was sitting there, I was listening to you talk, and I'm going, yeah, but work ethic. And then you said
Absolutely.
grit, and I'm like, yep, I would rather have somebody with lesser natural talent and more work ethic, grit, than anything else.
Well, and it's so funny because right at the end there, as you were heading towards, you're very skillful at looping back around to where you want to be. And, I was thinking to myself, okay, so the downside to natural is that you get the kid that's, he's been exposed to a lot of stuff. He's been a good ski racer. It came a little easier to him because or he gets in the car and it's coming a little bit easier to him because he's got a background that's helping him or whatever in some other sports, is that ultimately at some point they are going to find a tipping point to where they now need to work, right? And they need to work harder than they have been because they've been able to get to that 96th percentile pretty easily. Versus the person that really struggled to get to the 96th percentile, which is what you just talked about.
Yeah.
Right. And you run into that, I'll put a whole side thing to that, which is it's no surprise that there's a lot of people that come from fairly comfortable backgrounds in the auto racing business. And it's interesting to me in that some of those folks show up and they haven't ever had to really fight tooth and nail for something in their life. And some of them adapt super well to having to work really hard to get into a race car. And others just are okay doing what they're doing, right? They haven't developed that grit that I mentioned.
They're not hungry enough.
They're not hungry enough is another way of putting it, right? And it's, and that's, so there's part of, and they, by the way, could have the perfect background to be successful at auto racing. They could have been, mountain biking fanatics and ski racing and, and riding horses and doing all these other, riding motocross bikes and doing all these things, other things that would play into making them good in a race car, but that's only going to get them so far. Yeah. And you are absolutely right to where, I love tricking the people that, aren't necessarily naturals and getting them to where they are beating the people that are naturals. There's immense self-satisfaction in that. I'm sure you've had the same thing.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful little smile behind the trailer, time for me personally to make that happen. A lot of satisfaction in that. But, and then, a side thing is, I'm sure we're very similar in a lot of ways. If I get a driver that I'm working with long time and I'm talking to them about their fitness routine, I very simply say, yes, they need to be in shape, but everything they need to do to stay in shape, they need to involve movement. Right?
Yeah.
And that even comes to when you go to the gym, if you're lifting weights while standing on a Bosu ball, right? Or you're doing something where you've got some stability built into it, or there's some movement built into it, right? Because the fact of the matter is that you're not going to just be sitting statically in that car, moving that steering wheel. There's all sorts of other forces going on. There's movement involved. There's stuff coming at you, which loops back around to the light usage at the places like Pit Fit with Jim Leo, which is, there's movement involved in doing that, I've had drivers that, one of the skills I tried to teach myself when I turned 60, and I got pretty good at it, and I've now fallen off, bad pun, literally, was teaching myself to stand on top of a workout ball, right?
Yeah.
And I've had clients who are able to, hop up on a workout ball and do kettlebell drills and whatever, and I'm like, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, because that, as cool as that is, by the way, that's also going to pay off when you're in the car.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's kind of switch to another topic here. How many times have you worked with a driver and you're saying, I think you need to change the way you approach this corner. You need to do this a little differently. And they go, yeah, but that's not my style.
Yeah. Well, at that point, as soon as, and this ties into something you and I have said to each other before, right? Like, to me, when I hear somebody say style and driving in the same sentence, there's somebody that I know that one of my guys can beat. Because the fact of the matter is that there is no one style. You shouldn't have a style, right? What you should have is, to go back to something I said in the part one of this, which is you need a toolbox of skills. And you talked about when we were talking about vision, about turning into the corner, right? Like your steering speed into the corner, like steering speed itself. Like if you just look at something that simple, there's no one right way to turn the steering wheel, right? If you're one of those guys, that somebody beat into you early on, you got to be smooth. I got guys that can kick your ass in the car.
Yeah. Yeah.
because being smooth sometimes just isn't going to work for you, right? Turning smoothly in, no, not going to work, right? And there's times, and by the way, as you well know, and this is when it starts to get really cool, is when you're working with somebody and you get to the point to where you're like, okay, in this corner, I need you to turn your hands faster. Like I need you to really turn in, like boom. And then guess what? In the next corner, you're going to bend it in. You're going to just add steering and be bending, progressively adding steering in. And those two corners are back to back, right? And you get the guy that can do that. And that's the right style, which is, by the way, not a style at all. It's having a whole different set of tools to use when they're appropriate, which ties into a ton of what we talked about, at the last podcast.
So the style is, I've got an adaptable style.
Absolutely. The style is you do what makes the car work.
Yeah. And
right?
I wrote a whole article about steering wheel speed. Like some corners require that crisp, quick turn in, some bend in, that kind of thing. And, the same thing with brake release. Sometimes you need to come into a corner, you need to pop your foot off the brake pedal. Other times it's got to be a really slow release of the brake pedal. But it's, and like you said, it could be different from one corner to the next corner. And when I look at the best drivers, they are super hyper adaptable. Right. And, I used to use the example, and some people might kind of go, yeah, why are you using NASCAR? I think one of the things about NASCAR, even if you follow it just a little bit, you see the way different drivers approach the sport. And you look at Jimmy Johnson, and for years I'd say, what's Jimmy Johnson's style? And people go, I don't know. And I go, what's Kyle Busch's style? He drives the wheels off the thing, super aggressive, crashes a lot, and wins. Okay, how many championships has Jimmy Johnson won? How many championships has Kyle Busch won? And you go, the most adaptable driver, the driver that you almost can't say what their style is, they're going to win more often.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that, and it's interesting. You go back to, people being taught certain ways, this is how you do something or whatever, right? I have an acquaintance who's, he doesn't do it anymore, but at one point was in one of the top teams that did like those kind of randonnée races, those extreme races where you paddle down a river and then you hiked over 3 mountain ranges, and then you biked for 100 miles and whatever, right?
Yeah.
And I forget what those things were called. They were extreme something, right? And he was in one of the top teams, and they'd go all over the world and do this. And it came up one time that all the time the U.S. government would send like a Navy SEAL team to do these things, right? Toughest guys we have, right?
Yeah.
And he said that they would consistently not do well, because those guys were and I was like, well, why is that? They're obviously fit. They've got a wide skill range. They've got grit, right? And all that. And he'd say, well, the problem is that they all have this mentality to where they're tough guys. And if those guys are in the middle of the 100-mile run or a 50-mile run with backpacks on day 3, and they've crossed a river and they're soaking wet, and one guy starts to get a blister, he doesn't put his hand up and be like, excuse me, I got to stop and fix this and take care of it now before it gets to be a problem, because he's too tough, right? He's got that mindset going in. And he goes, whereas the good teams like our team, we're all like, oh man, we got to fix problems before they get to be bigger problems. And, and that comes back around to me, that's sort of the mindset of having a style, right? Oh, that's not our style to stop because that's too wimpy, right? You got to have adaptability. That goes back to the rules of Darwinism, right? The rules of Darwinism, the rules of Darwinism in the simplest way, which, by the way, I used to have, Slide Rule Motorsports, my company, used to have T-shirts that said, adapt, migrate, or die. And those are your 3 options. And those are your 3 options in Darwinism, right? Those are your choices. So, by the way, if the car's not turning well enough, what do? You adapt, right?
Yeah. And in some ways, that sort of captures everything we've talked about in the previous part of this podcast. And this one is, there are no rules.
No.
There are guidelines, there are directions, there are suggestions, but the sooner you can start off kind of focused on one little part of it, but the more you can adapt your style, right. I was going to use that word, and maybe part of that comes back to how do you define style. I got to think about that one a little bit, but
right.
The more you can adapt to those things, the more successful you're going to be.
Absolutely. And I think you summed it up, where your style is not having a style, but, and to me, it's just doing whatever you have to do to make the car work.
Yeah.
And the reason that some of those guys are those guys that can do that win championships is because you don't always get the car that you want. Right. So you have to learn to drive the car you have, not the one you want. So you've got to be able to do that and drive it to 100%. And by the way, part of that style, with air quotation marks, is realizing that on certain days you've got a 7th place car.
Yes.
Right.
That's one of the things that I respect, appreciate about NASCAR drivers. When a guy like Jimmy Johnson will say, had a 8th place car today and I brought it home 7th.
Right.
Super happy.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And then, thinking about styles, and again, Kyle Busch has improved, but there was a point in Kyle Busch's career was I had an 8th place car and I tried to win the race with it today and took out 12 cars in a crash.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And so that's part of it as well, I think. You reminded me of something else that you had mentioned before was Porsche oversteer. And one of the things that just again, kind of gets me all riled up and turns me into that cranky old man is when somebody goes, oh, you got to drive it differently. That's a Porsche.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I know. Yeah. And I actually, I had with one of my clients, I ran, this was 3-4 years ago. We ran a couple of years of the GT3 Cup, right?
Yep.
And the Porsche GT3 Cup. And I got to tell you, it was, I was a little bit insulated from the Porsche world for a while,
Yeah.
So that's sort of one of those things that kind of fades into the background, right? And then, I was working in the GT3 Cup, and, people would either find out about it with other people I was working with or whatever. And, God, did that, number one, it was like, oh, you got to drive that car totally differently. It was like, really?
Was it have like a fifth wheel on it?
Yeah, because I'm not seeing that on data and all the, analysis stuff. And by the way, what I'm telling them that's working, you know, and, yeah. And I literally, and I'm still, I've got some Porsche guys I work with a bit now, and was recently at a Porsche weekend. I'm headed to one this weekend. And it was like, the whole Porsche oversteer thing. And, and that leads into the bigger picture, which is, I don't want to feel like I'm bashing Porsche people here, or people with, what is basically at this point urban legend for, for Porsches, that they all oversteer at the limit, which they most definitely don't do, by the way, which is that, there's so many preconceived notions of, I've got a front engine car, you got to drive it this way.
Yeah.
I've got a front wheel drive, you have to drive it this way. It's a rear wheel drive, rear engine car, you have to drive it this way. It's a mid engine car with 4-wheel drive, you have to drive it this way. And that goes back to, that ties right into our style thing, right? Keep looping things around, and something that I know that you and I agree with it all the time. It's, at the end of the day, you got a racetrack, you got a driver, and you got a car. And those three things need to work as one organic organism. And I don't care, quite frankly, as a coach, and this is the competitive side of me coming out, I could care less what you're doing to make those three things work together as well as they can, right? What we got to do is figure out what is going to make those three things work as well as they can, and we'll be faster than the other people.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
And the last I looked, every one of those cars, because I'm using the word cars here, has 4 tires.
Right.
It has a steering wheel, it has a gas pedal, and a brake pedal.
Right.
And, this goes back to something that I say all the time. And, this is not a rule, this is a guideline, but, the trick advanced stuff that people are looking for. And, when they start saying this is a rear wheel drive, mid engine, whatever, front wheel drive, whatever, you got to change. Now, all the advanced stuff, it's just doing the basics better than everybody else. Why does Scott Dixon win so much? Because he does the basics better than everybody else on a consistent basis.
Right. Yep.
So,
yeah. Yeah. And it's that, is the tire at 100%.
Yeah.
And by the way, with your Porsche, if you're driving around and that car is oversteering, if whatever your local shop set your Porsche up, and your Porsche does have oversteer as its static balance, then by the way, you're not getting 100% out of the front tires, and you need to change the balance.
Fix it.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, that's just simple physics, right? Yeah. If you're driving around and one of those tires is being underutilized in some way, then there's an issue. It's pretty simple. And that just, but once again, that comes back around to, it's a whole package of doing things correctly.
Yeah.
And it's not being, it's adaptability. It's not being locked into one mindset, one way of doing things. And by the way, that all ties into preconceived notions as well. Right. I'm as I said here at one point, I am not I'm not the best at anything. And I don't understand everything. And the fact of the matter is there's still times where, sometimes when you are trying to get something to work or trying to get a driver to do something, you got to go counterintuitive. And it works, with their input or whatever. Right. And it's just like, oh, yeah, I guess there's some factor coming in there that I didn't understand or get, and we're now compensating for that.
Well, I would say that a common theme amongst the best drivers and the best coaches is beyond the work ethic and all those other things we've talked about, but it's a curiosity. It's a desire to figure things out, learn more. You touched on it when we first talked in our first part about great teacher. You got to be a great learner. And, I think one of the things that makes you a great coach is you're not locked in. You're constantly going, what can I learn? And, we talked about this about what have you learned from skiing, from ski racing that can apply here? What have you learned from cycling, so we take all these different things and we apply them, and that just makes us a better all-around driver. And I think we touched on this the first time around. The first part is balance. If the only thing that you ever do is think about, I'm going to turn in late, I'm going to come off the brakes, and I'm going to immediately go back to power, every now and then you're going to be fast.
Right.
But not consistently.
Yeah, it's going to work someplace.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's going to work someplace in the car you have at that time.
On that day. Yeah.
Right. But so then let's go back to that. That brings us right back to styles and adaptabilities.
Yeah.
Which is, you've just, and this is, we sound like a couple old fuddy-duddies sitting around the fireplace right now, because we keep being like, oh my God, have you run into this, or you've had this happen, right? But, how many times have you, had somebody, they're at Mid-Ohio, and you've gone out, you've done a session at 8:30 in the morning or 9 in the morning, and you're great. The car balance is really good. Driver's doing a great job. You're where you should be in the timesheets, right? Things are looking up, and you go back out at 2:00 and everything is crap, right? And everything is crap because that driver went out, and even despite our best efforts of saying, hey, by the way, at Mid-Ohio, when this track gets above X degrees or whatever, it goes to crap, right? It isn't going to have as much grip. This is going to happen. You're going to need to compensate for this. And that driver has been like, okay, all this stuff worked for me in the morning. I just need to, you've got, Charlie Brown's teacher is what you feel like talking to him, right? There's this little voice on, right? Wah, 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 right? Is what you've said to him. So they go out and they're like, I'm just going to do everything I did this morning except be even a little better at it. And they're horrible, right? And it's because they have not adapted to what needs to happen, right? Their style hasn't adapted to what Mid-Ohio has become in the afternoon at 2:00. And that's just one more way of closing this loop of how everything ties back around,
And to take that to an extreme, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, you hear drivers at Indy and leading up to the 500. I personally know drivers, friends, who have had massive crashes there, got hurt, and unfortunately been killed trying to do the same thing that worked the day before or earlier in the day.
Right.
And it didn't work because of track conditions, and they didn't adapt. So,
right.
So Mike, I think we will wrap up part 2 here. I always ask my guests now, what is your speed secret? What's the one piece of advice that you would give people listening to this show?
Well, it ties directly into what we've been talking about, which is the never stop learning, right? And to me, you are, I look at you as a contemporary of mine in the coaching business. I've got a huge amount of respect for you, and I love reading your stuff, and I learn stuff from you all the time. But the fact of the matter is that you are a wonderful resource for this stuff. And there is a lot of stuff out there. I would trust what I get from Ross Bentley. I wouldn't always trust everything I read on the forums or whatever, but there's pieces of information out there. There's, you're going to a racetrack, start looking at YouTube videos, but look at it with a critical eye, look at data somebody's put up, talk to people, read all the books that are available, read books that don't have stuff to do about auto racing, but just basically be a student.
Yeah.
And be a student with an open mind that's also looking at things with a critical eye, right? Or an analytical eye. I'm not sure what the right word is there, but just making sure that you don't just bluntly believe everything, because then you're going to come back around to me. You're going to come out walking up to me this, next weekend, and you're going to be one of those guys that says, well, Russ Bentley said that I should do this. And I'm going to be like, God, Ross, it's Ross again, but all kidding aside, there are no absolutes.
Yeah.
But there is also, quite frankly, these two episodes that you're going to turn this into, as I pointed out at the end of the last one, they aren't just rants. They're us just saying, oh my God, there's so many preconceived notions out there and so many people that believe that this is right? When in reality, there is nothing that's right. It's all right at the right time.
Well put. And first of all, I would say, do not trust everything that I say, because I don't trust everything that I say. And I think if you begin to trust everything that you think, whoever you are listening to this, you're in trouble. And the thing that I'd add to I couldn't agree more again is never stop looking at videos, looking at all that, but keep asking why. Like, why is that driver doing that? And when you understand that, you're much better able to adapt. And I think maybe that's the whole thing that we've been pounding at as the cranky old guys ranting over the past two podcasts here. So, hey, Mike, thanks so much for doing this. This has been an absolute blast.
Absolutely.
And we'll trying to think of where the last time we bumped into each other. One of the times that I think is really kind of weird that we bumped into each other at track is, I'm wandering out to the grandstand on the outside of the Dunlop curve at Le Mans, and I get up into the corner.
You were in my seat.
And it's like, what are you doing here? So,
well, it's kind of amazing because you and I obviously have a lot of parallels, right?
Yeah.
And I think I posted a picture from Shanghai, I think.
Yeah.
And I think you might have even sent me a picture, but it literally had to be within a seat or two of the same place where we had decided that was the right place to watch, which to me was a little,
creepy,
a little scary, a little creepy.
Yeah.
But and by the way, so here's the next subject we're going to talk about, which is a thing I came across last night, and I need to start working. I'm going to totally mess up this word, but it's a brachistochrone curve.
Oh yeah,
which is the fastest. Do you know about that?
Yeah.
So it's like one. And by the way, never stop learning.
Yep.
Here's an example. My evening tonight is going to be reading about a brachistochrone, or however the heck you pronounce it, curve, which is the fastest route for a ball, and it's not a straight line down an incline.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So to me, and I know that by reading that, there is going to be some little glimmer of information that I'll probably end up using next weekend.
Yeah. That is so cool, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I came across. There's in your goofing around trying to figure all this. There's a really cool video online about it. That
is there?
As a demonstration. You got to find that. If I can find it, I'll send it to you too. So
yeah.
Again, Mike, thanks for being on the show. Thanks for everybody listening to this and listening to a couple old guys being cranky and ranting about stuff and having some fun talking about what we care the most about.
Always a pleasure, Ross. Good talking with you.
Okay, and we'll see you somewhere at a track somewhere.
Yep. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
If you like this episode, then do yourself and Ross a big favor. Subscribe to the Speed Secrets podcast. You'll hear from experts on driving, engineering, brain function, and much, much more. Then share it with a friend or two, or three, or leave a comment, or suggest a guest. And be sure to come back for more interesting podcasts. As Ross always says, keep learning and having fun.